None of us want to believe that this will be canceling games in September. That feels like a really long way away, and it feels like a lost summer if we're doing that. But I think the fact that the NFL has baked this into the schedule, if this report is correct, is really smart. Because the last thing we would want to see is the NFL have this kind of wonky, ridiculous half schedule where you get into the playoffs and the tiebreakers are weird and nobody knows who should get in or who shouldn't get in, and they've got to kind of shoehorn other ways to break ties into the playoff format. I think this is really smart because what ends up happening is if you get all 16 games in, God bless, great. But if you don't, you have a 12-game schedule that, to me, still has most of the integrity of the NFL schedule. It's not great. I'd much rather see 10-6 instead of a 12-game schedule where, 6-6 might make the playoffs, or 8-4 might be the best record of the AFC or NFC, and that doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like there's enough games there to really separate. If you're 7-5, how much better are you than 6-6? But at the end of the day, getting 12 games in is kind of like a college football schedule, and we by and large think that a college football schedule is good enough to decide who wins conferences, especially with conference championship games at the end. So I think it's kind of break glass in case of emergency, and that's fine. I don't like to think of the NFL not getting that first month in, especially if there's no fans. It would be hard to imagine we're still canceling events in early September if there's no fans also, but it's a possibility. So watch for that tonight here as part of the schedule release, and if it's the case, it means that the NFL is concerned about that and looking to do something about it, and I applaud that. I mean, look, if we get a baseball schedule that has 110 games, it's not perfect, but it's something, and I think it's better than having 70 games. It does feel at least somewhat of integrity. And I think the same thing with the NFL. I don't know if you could have an 8-game schedule, but if you go back to the strike of 1982, the NFL had a 9-game schedule, and you then had a extra added bonus round of playoffs. That's how they played that in 82, where I believe it was a 9-game schedule that they got in, and then they had an extra round of playoffs to decide a champion. That was the Washington-Miami John Riggins Super Bowl, and nobody ever goes back and says, oh, Washington didn't deserve to win that championship. They weren't that good. No, that was Joe Gibbs' first championship in Washington, and Joe Theismann and John Riggins, and Theismann certainly doesn't give back that ring, and neither does Riggins. So I think we would have a champion that's crowned as a real champion and people would respect it, but it's hard to decide who gets to the playoffs if you have less than half the schedule played.